23. I'm in the red Chumashim because I want to be able to also have the Hebrew available. But if you want to follow along in the colorful commentary, page 120, verse 11.
Is page 3 something?
I'm on page 323,
And what was the other page?
page 120. I'm in verse 11. We just had the story where we learned about, sorry, in this one we're on page 120, and then this one, 323. We read last time all the way through Moshe being born and being raised in Pharaoh's daughter's house. And we talked about the interesting way that the women play a role in the early story of the Exodus narrative. And now we're going to get into chapter 2, looking in particular about who Moses is and his journey toward becoming commissioned by God. We're going to get into chapter 3 today and look specifically at the story of the burning bush. And next time what we're going to do, which is not next week because I'm out of town at a conference next week, but the following week we're going to look at the way that God introduces God's self to Moshe. Right? One way in chapter 3 and one way in chapter 6. And you could make the argument that it is in chapter 6, that is for the first time, that God reveals God's self to Moshe as the Yud He Vav He. Right? As the tetragrammaton, as the what we'll call the J source. All right? And I'm going to give you an article to read between now and next week as a framework. And I like the article for several reasons. One is it will give you a nice, concise summary of the JEPD stuff that we've been talking about. So any of you who didn't understand what on earth we were describing before, you can reread it in a very nice, concise way. And you're going to get to see the introduction of this new name of God and where it comes from and why it's here now. And one of the questions that Jerry likes to ask is, wait a second, we seem to be going back in the same story between a J story and an E story all in the same text. Why is that actually happening? Okay, so I'm on verse 11, page 323 in the red, page 120 in the Friedman book. And the text starts with one of my favorite kinds of phrases in the Torah, which is a Vayehi bayamim hahem, which literally means in those days or sometime later. And it's a way of trying to articulate that time has passed without giving us a concrete number of years or days to express what that time is like. So we know that Moshe is in Pharaoh's house, and it says in the text that Moses grows up, and he goes out and he witnesses what's happening. Vayar v'sivotam. He literally sees the burden, the labor that's going on there. Vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri me'echav. And he sees an Egyptian who is beating a Hebrew, but the text adds this interesting word, me'echav, that the person who is being beaten is one of his brethren, which is an interesting thing for Moses to acknowledge. Okay, why is it interesting? Why? Understand?
He's been raised as an Egyptian.
He seems to be raised as an Egyptian. But for whatever reason, the text is choosing to tell us that Moses has this awareness that the person who is being impacted here, the vulnerable one, is like him. We don't know why. We don't know how he knows it, but it seems that he has this awareness. We could guess, yeah, go ahead, Bob.
How can you be certain that Moses is aware of it?
Good question.
He might just have reacted to the injustice.
That's true. But why then does it say me'echav?
To tell her.
No, because the author
Uh-huh.
is trying to say that, that I know, the author knows that he...
Okay, so what are you going to call that author?
Well, according to this...
You're going to say that it is J. All right? Now, what's the goal of J? If you wanted to make an argument that it's J.
Elevate Moses.
Elevate Moses. What else? Who are we going to choose here? We're going to choose...
God.
We're going to choose God. We're going to choose specifically the Yahweh name of God, right? As opposed to the Elohim name of God, because that could be construed or connected to a different tradition. But there may be another reason. This is what we call the narrator of the Torah, right? The anonymous voice of the Torah, right? As if to say, the Torah wants to tell us information about Moshe that you might not have already thought about to help you understand the text.
I mean, he was raised with his mother, he was
Right. So that's an interesting thing.
In primitive countries, kids can nurse for 5-6 years.
Totally.
Yeah, but here it says that he was brought to Pharaoh's daughter and she made him
That's
her
right.
son.
So this is an
But
interesting
that
thing.
was after,
Good.
that was after you weaned.
Well, no,
But he
no,
might
no,
have
no,
thought
that
his
was...
mother was just a nurse.
Look at verse 10. Go back to verse 10. Vayigdal hayeled. By the way, it says in verse 10, it says Vayigdal hayeled, the child grows up. And in verse 11, it says Vayigdal Moshe. Right? Same language, but now he has a name. And it says Vativi'ehu levat Paro. He is brought to the daughter of Pharaoh. Vayehi la leven. And he is for her a son. To her a son. And then it says, Vatikra Shmo Moshe, and she calls him Moshe, and then there's a play on the words of being drawn out of the water. Okay?
So, it seems to me that if you kind of reduce Moses to the essence, he's somebody from the royal household that's now, someone is promoting him as really a Hebrew.
Yep.
But who is he really? What's his primary, what's his genetic stream?
Exactly.
And I don't know about this because I think that there's a lot of backpedaling to say that the Jews are following Moses. Don't worry about it. He may look like he came from the Egyptian royal house, but there's really a way that we consider him to be a Hebrew.
Totally. But you can actually take it a step further. Not only do we not know who Moshe is, he doesn't know who Moshe is. And so when he does this act of killing the Egyptian, what is his initial reaction? To run away. If he really was an Egyptian,
Run away.
he might not have run away, he might have also killed him. He might have taken part in the beating. If he really was a Hebrew, then maybe he's trying to defend the Hebrews. If he doesn't know who he is, he doesn't have enough kerchus, if you will, enough strength to stand his ground.
Yeah, but he's basically an adopted child. And if you look at adopted children, if they're adopted at a young age, and he was obviously adopted at a very young age, he didn't know anything at that point.
Right.
An adopted child generally accepts whoever his or her parents are,
Right.
and that's the identity that person accepts.
So which
So
parent?
how can he, I don't know how he could possibly see himself as being a Hebrew? I mean, he was adopted as an
Maybe his
Egyptian.
mother already told him.
Well, which mother?
The one who weaned him.
Well, that's an interesting question. By the way, the word Vayigdal can also connote weaning, right? It's not just that he grew up, but presumably he's grown up to an age where he is no longer nursing, right? And there's other references to that early in Breshit and Genesis that do the same thing. Stan?
Remember that there's a purpose to the story.
Good. What's the purpose?
The purpose of the story is to have Moses become the leader for the people to become the exodus of Egypt.
It's an interesting way of thinking about how the story is written. Is the story being written as it's happening, or is someone recalling the story and telling it to you? Right? Forget authorship for a moment, but whoever is the narrator wants to tell you something specific.
So if he didn't realize that he was a Hebrew, the narrative wouldn't work.
Yep.
No, that's not true.
Why?
I would have great respect for him. If he thinks he's an Egyptian and he sees this injustice and he kills the Egyptian, that's great moral character.
That's right. It actually doesn't say what he is in the text. If you look at the Hebrew, it says, Vayar v'silotam, he sees them doing their labor, they're struggling, and this is what he does. Vayar ish mitzri, he turns one way and he sees ish mitzri, an Egyptian man, hitting ish ivri. Right, so he sees two separate ones, and then the text says, me'echa. So he actually sees them as two independent people, and then he links the Hebrew one as his brethren. Now, we don't know why, though, right? Is it because he just empathizes with them? Because he's being...
They look different.
Oh.
I think that's the obvious one. Why are we missing that?
And not only do they look different, but one looks more like him.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
That's right. He knows that.
Well, yeah, you say it looks like him. I mean,
Well,
they're all Middle Eastern. They all probably look the same at that time.
Right.
But here's the question for you, though.
Moses looked like a Jew.
Hold on one second.
I mean, what's always puzzled me is why did he have to kill the Egyptian? He was coming from Pharaoh's household. He had to have a certain amount. He was like a prince. He had to have a certain amount of authority. Why did he just tell the guy to stop?
Great question. It's a great question. And I love Moshe's response. Look at verse 12. Verse 12 says, Vayifen ko bacho. He looks this way and that way. He's literally checking out the landscape. Is there anyone who is watching me in this moment? By the way, it could also be, is there anyone watching to see if anyone else might react in this moment, not just him? Vayar ki ein ish. And he looks around and he sees that there is no man. In this case, he uses the word ish, but it's not linked to an Egyptian or a Hebrew. There's nobody around. Vayach et hamitzri vayitmenehu b'cho. He strikes down the Egyptian, and he covers him in the sand. All right, or hides him in the sand.
One more thing to
Yeah.
remember, that when Moses was born, there was the decree that the sons of the Hebrews would be killed.
Yep.
So he has no reason to think he was a son of his mother.
Right. And the best part is going to come in just a second because the Hebrews are going to respond. Ready? In verse 13, Vayitzei bayom hashini, he goes out on the second day, so presumably after this has happened. V'hinei shnei anashim ivrim nitzim. There were 2 Hebrews that were there, and they were fighting. So he said to the offender, "Why do you strike your fellow?" He retorted, "Who made you chief and ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" All right? So people saw him. And by the way, they don't see him necessarily as another Hebrew. At least it's not clear in the text that they do see him as a Hebrew or not. But the question is, in verse 14, it says, Mi samcha le'ish sar v'shofet aleinu. Who made you better than us, more powerful than us, that you should rule over us? Are you going to do to us what you did to the other Egyptian? Okay? So what does Moshe do? Gets scared, people know about it, and he runs away. Yeah.
The interesting thing to me is in verse 14,
Yep.
who made you commander and judge over us?
Yep.
That's sort of like a harbinger of what's going to come. We're going to find out who's going to make you commander.
That's right. And by the way, there's 2 different words here. The word is sar v'shofet. Right? So what's a shofet? Judge. Right? What's a sar?
Commanders.
Could be a commander or it could be
Prince.
a prince. Why do you think they use the word sar in this case?
Because he is a prince.
He is a prince. Right?
But not over them.
Well, that's the
That's
interesting
what he's
question. But he is a prince because he grows up being raised by the princess. He is a prince. He's got royal yichus, if you will.
So isn't he allowed to
In the
do anything
commentary
he
here,
wants?
it says something about that Moses was aware that if he killed the Egyptian, he would be cut off from his ties to the aristocratic society.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know what that was about? I mean, that makes it seem like it was not appropriate for him to kill an Egyptian, even if someone of lower status.
Yeah, I mean, but that's a commentary. That's a read on that. And by the way, there's a risk of him losing on both sides, right? If he steps in and intervenes, he could get in trouble from Pharaoh saying, "Why did you do this? You shouldn't be doing it." If he kills the Egyptian, he could get in trouble not just for murder, but for killing one of his own people. If he does nothing, then his people may say to him, "Why didn't you?" I mean, he's pretty much caught between a rock and a hard place. But he chooses to act, and it's not clear where the action comes from. Is it he just has this emotional empathy for the Hebrew, or is it because he knows that he's somehow connected to them, that they are his people? Yeah.
It's kind of interesting, who made you chief and ruler over us? He
Yeah.
is ruler over them, and as an Egyptian, as a prince, and so that to me is a kind of a strange,
Yes.
strange
Why
line.
question it?
Right. Why question
is the
it?
prince.
But there's actually 2 different ways of reading it. One is to say, why are you ruler over us? Because you are actually not Egyptian. But it doesn't say that.
Right.
Or, you really are Egyptian, therefore you are ruler over us, but now you get to decide when you do and don't do what you're going to do.
So again, it's just adding a little bit of that confusion as to him.
Exactly. And if you look in verse 15, after this whole thing, once he knows that the matter is known, it says, Vayishma paro et hadavar hazeh. Pharaoh hears about what happened. Vayivakesh laharog et Moshe. And Pharaoh wants to kill Moses.
Is that all they do? They hear something, they just want to kill each other?
Is that all that different from some things today?
Well, this is his daughter's son,
Yeah,
his
his
grandson. Why
Except,
didn't he
It
at
looks
least
bad.
bring him in and find out the circumstance, put him in
Yeah.
jail?
yeah, that's
I'm
true.
thinking of today.
So who-
But I'm saying, man, why would Moses be afraid of stopping this Egyptian rather than killing him and thinking that Pharaoh would come down on him? Because he has the relationship with Pharaoh. He would think that he could say, tell the guy to stop hitting him.
So who's the
Pharaoh's
only-
his grandpa, it's not going to hurt him.
There's a question though, does Pharaoh know who Moses actually is?
He probably does.
Well,
he has
it's
to
an
know.
interesting question. We know that she knows, the daughter knows, because
She said?
in the previous verse we know that she opens up the basket and sees that it's a Hebrew boy.
Right.
Right? So she knows, but we don't know if Pharaoh knows.
It was an immaculate birth.
Yeah.
Well, look, if you think about the movies, when they portray this scene, the movies often suggest that the daughter goes to dad and says, I want to keep him, and he says, no, you can't, he's a Hebrew. She says, no, I want to keep him anyway, and raise him as Egyptian, and finally he concedes.
Well, didn't Pharaoh test him when he was a baby?
Test him
When
for what?
he was a young child, and the thing with the gold and the coals?
Not in the text.
He was
Commentaries.
probably circumcised, right? When was
Yes, he was
I think
circumcised, but there's also reason to believe historically that Egyptians were circumcised.
He's not lost
So
his
what
tongue.
about the name? Did the name Moses, was it given to him, is it a Hebrew name then, or, I mean, now you know if someone's from Ireland or not, just by what their name is. So
Yeah.
They think it's
What
an
about his
Egyptian
name?
name because
It's a
think of
purely-
people like Thutmose and so forth. All these Egyptian names are
Princess
Moses.
Moses.
Turn back one page, look at page 323, and look at the commentary where it talks about Moshe's name. So I'm on the middle section of the page where it says on the left side Moses. Everyone see that? All right, it says, the Hebrew Moshe is of Egyptian origin. Its verbal stem, Mishi, means to be born, and the noun ms is a child or a son. It is a frequent part of ancient Egyptian personal names, usually with the addition of the name of a god, as illustrated by, and there's a few different ones that I won't try to pronounce, and two papyri from the time of Ramses II mention an official name of Mosi. And if you look one more column over, a Hebrew origin for the name is attributed to the Egyptian princess. Through a wordplay, the Egyptian Mosi is connected with the name Moshe, which means to draw out. And this is one of the things that usually when there's names in the Torah, there's always an explanation given. And in this case, they played on the word Mishitihu. So here's the Moshe, the Mem Shin root that you're saying is Egyptian, and they're going to play on it and connect and make it Moshe, which makes it sound like it could be a Hebrew name, but not necessarily.
Can I point out just one other thing?
Yeah.
So, I don't think the word Hebrew is used anywhere in Genesis.
Hebrew,
I think it's used in Abraham's covenant, isn't it?
It's by Abraham and it's by Joseph. It's identified as a Hebrew.
Yeah.
Okay, because
It's definitely
the
there a
Pharaoh-
couple times.
The Pharaoh never mentions them as being Hebrews, yet now everybody's a Hebrew. That's
Uh,
one point
what
that
I
out.
have, what I have learned somewhere is that
Yeah.
Hebrew was the name that they gave themselves when talking to non-Israelites.
Say it again, Frank.
Hebrew was the word that was used when talking to a non-Israelite.
Uh-huh.
So you'd say, I am a Hebrew, I am a Hebrew.
Right.
But just like you might be Hittite or Amori or Yebusi
Right.
or whatever. But they didn't use it in speak between one another. to stand
Right.
for
There's
the-
another reason given. If you go back to the maps in the back of the Tanakh for a second, in the back of the Torah, and there's a map. The second map says it has a picture of the southern part of Israel and the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. It's the map that looks like this. Okay. So if you look where Ramses is, does everyone see where Ramses is? I'm on this map here.
Yes.
The Israelites actually did not live in Egypt. I mean, like in kind of Egypt proper. They lived in the next town over, in the space over called Goshen. And Ivri comes from the root avar. What does avar mean?
Crossover.
To cross over. And it's not clear if that word is referring to the idea that they've crossed over like the river or whatnot, or if they lived in the place that's over there. Me'ever la Yarden, on the other side of the Jordan or on the other side of the whatever. But in Ivri can also refer to the geographic location of where they are. They're not in Egypt per se, they're on the other side, so to speak. Yeah.
I think one of the things that puzzles me is that I thought about who could a prince kill that would get him into trouble. It seems to me if it was a common person, the prince would be preeminent over him and no one would care.
Especially if it was a Hebrew.
But if it was an Egyptian from the royal household that he killed,
Yep.
someone of stature,
Yep.
then that connotes maybe there was tension within the royal house and two factions in the royal house. And Moses was playing out within the context of that controversy.
Yeah.
And maybe, getting back to the politics, maybe the people who left Egypt were all followers of this faction.
Right.
And if they were Hebrews, they would say, why the hell should we follow this guy from the Egyptian royalty? Why should we follow him out into the desert?
Right.
So you need to give him a backstory to show why he's really a good guy
Right.
for the Hebrews to follow.
Right.
So, he did these things, he protected a
Right.
Hebrew, he was really born to a Hebrew woman.
Right.
And all of these things may not be nothing more than to establish credibility
That's absolutely
for
right.
Moses. Who
And
is
not
an
only
Egyptian.
that, when we get to the place where Moses meets God for the first time, and he says, "Who do I tell them you are?" Right? Moses has to go through several iterations with God reinforcing that confidence. Each time God has to come up with a different name for God's self as a way of trying to show the people that they are connected to this God in a particular way. And so it's the same thing, because Moses can't rest on his own laurels. He has to have God behind him, but it has to be the same God with whom there's a covenant from before. So I think that's a good point, yeah.
And I'm just looking at a commentary on page 322, commentary number 5 at the bottom. And it's, I don't know if this is right or not, but it seems to indicate that Pharaoh's daughter came to identify with the Hebrews. In fact, it's saying that she actually went on the Exodus with the Hebrews when they left Egypt.
Yeah.
And so maybe based on that, maybe she actually raised Moses as a Hebrew.
That's an interesting question. The challenge with not the challenge with the commentary, but the challenge of using the commentary to explain the text is that now you're using additional layers of interpretation, midrash, Talmudic sources, commentaries, to help you understand what the pshat is, right? To help you understand what the simple text is saying. We're intentionally avoiding that.
Yeah, because it makes a leap to saying his kinfolk, and the next question, how do you get
It's
there?
kind of like that story you all probably heard in religious school, for those of you who did that or heard it in your shul. The story about how when Abraham took over his dad's store, his idol shop for the day, right? And he leaves and then he destroys all the idols and then he comes back and his dad says, "What happens?" And he says, "Well, this idol started fighting with that idol and this idol with that idol." Where is that story in the Torah? It's not there. It's a rabbinic interpretation. It's a midrash in order to be able to try to understand why it is that Moshe is the one who's chosen to do this lech lecha moment, to leave. So we have to just be careful to know where that's coming from. It's a great story, but to understand what role it plays. Right now we're just trying to understand the simple meaning of the text, which by the way is not so simple.
I was thinking about that, going back to the impulsive nature of Moses.
Yeah.
It foretells some other, because he's known, he goes to the extremes very quickly.
Totally.
So this was probably one of the first.
This is one of his first impulsive moments.
Yes.
Absolutely. And what does he do, by the way, after this all happens? He runs away and he goes to Midian. All right? And when he gets there, he finds this Kohen, this Midianite priest, who's got 7 daughters. And he comes, once again, this is interesting, in verse 16, they come out to draw water and fill their troughs with water from their father's flock. But shepherds came and drove them off, and Moses comes to defend them. This is a popular story that we have, where patriarchal figures meet women who are at the well, who are watering, and the guy comes up and is this macho person and comes to their rescue. And I want to just point out this for a moment. If you look at verse 18, it says, they returned to their father's house, and this guy's name is Reuel. Reuel is the one who is the friend of El, the friend of God. Usually we know him as Jethro. There's a great midrash that says that Yitro actually had 7 different names, and that each of the names expresses a different kind of relationship between him and God. There's one that's Chovav, Yeter, there's a bunch of them. But here we first meet him as Reuel. And he says, how is it that you came back so soon? And listen to the answer in verse 19. Vatomarna ish mitzri hitzilanu miyad haroim. An Egyptian man saved me, or saved us, from the shepherds. He even drew water for us in the flocks.
Were the Midianites Hebrews?
No. They're not. All right? So the Midianite women see Moshe as Ish Mitzri. as an Egyptian man. It's an interesting thing because we've been having this back and forth, this play on who's killing whom. Is it an Ish Mitzri? Is it an Ish Ivri? Is it from his brethren, not his brethren? But they see him as Ish Mitzri. And he says to his daughters, where is he then? Why'd you leave him? Bring him in, have him eat. Moses consented to stay. And of course, it just happens like that. He gets a wife to marry. If it only were that easy, right? If only dating were that easy, right?
Yes, bore a son.
Huh?
And
Right.
bore a son,
And
by the
yes, and she bore a son to him named Gershom.
Right after the water.
All right. And the reason why he gets the name Gershom is, again, it's a play on words
Ger is a foreign word.
of Ger Sham. Okay, he was a stranger there. And the text actually tells us, it says, Vayikra Shmo Gershom, Ki Amar Ger Hayiti Be'eretz Nochriya. I was a stranger, Be'eretz Nochriya. Eretz Nochriya can either mean a foreign land, but a Nochri is actually someone who is of a different faith. It actually can be used in a derogatory way to say a non-Jew. All right, or whatnot. We often talk about Nochrim as there's a whole tractate of Talmud that talks about people of other faiths, and they're often called Nochrim.
Like heathen?
Huh?
Heathen?
Could be. Yeah, you can be used in that manner as well. And so he's away. He has this whole story at the well. He gets a wife. They have a child. They name him, interestingly, a reflection of what's going on for Moshe. All right, so now he's an Egyptian man, maybe a Hebrew man. He's got a Midianite wife with a Midianite son. By the way, she's a priestess. Okay, so we got all of these different dynamics going on.
How do you know that?
Because we know that her father is a Midianite priest. She's the daughter.
Oh, every
Is that
daughter of a
automatic?
priest is
Yeah, I
a
mean
priest?
she's from priestly royalty.
Okay.
All right, and then we have another one of these phrases. Vayehi bayamim harabim hahem. More time has passed. We don't know how much time. Vayamot melech Mitzrayim. The king of Egypt dies. And then I would make the argument, or I like to make the argument, that this part of the text is the transformative moment when everything with regard to the Exodus gets set in motion. And by the way, if you look in Friedman, you will notice that it is in a different color. So the king dies, and then we have these series of verbs. Vayiyanchu b'nei Yisrael min havodah. They were groaning under their labors. Vayiz'aku, they cry out for help. Vata'al shavatam, and their plea, whatever their cry, rises up. El ha'elohim min ha'avodah. It rises up to God. Verse 24, Vayishma Elohim enakatam, and God hears their grumbling. Vayiskor Elohim et brito, and God remembers their breeds, the covenant, his breeds, et Abraham and Yitzchak et Yaakov, that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Vayar Elohim et bnei Yisrael vayidai Elohim. And God saw bnei Yisrael and took note of them and knew them. Now, if I want to introduce the language of a brit, typically, who is the authorship? Priestly. And that's exactly what they've done here. All of a sudden, where God seems to be absent up until now in the Exodus narrative, all of a sudden, God takes note of the people, hears their suffering, and sees them, and is able to begin the process of setting in motion the Exodus from Egypt because God recalls the breeds. Notice the language in verse 24. It is God who hears their suffering, and it is God who remembers. It's not the people. It's God who remembers. And now we're going to get to the moment of commissioning. Chapter 3. Chapter 3 starts by telling us a little bit about Moshe's yichus. Does everyone know what the word yichus means?
Yeah.
His familial connections. Moshe, haya ro'eh, he was a shepherd. Haya ro'eh et son yitro chodno kohen mijan. He was the shepherd that tended the flock of Jethro, not Reuel. Okay? It's a good question. Why did they change his name? Well, yeah. I'm glad that you're saying that because it's a great response, right? Audrey said, so Barbara said, why is it a different name? And Audrey said it's a different author. All right? Which, by the way, independent if it were true or not, it's a great question to ask. Why all of a sudden would the Torah introduce us to a different name? Do you want to say something?
No, there are 9 different ways of answering that question.
Totally.
And it's just one of the reasons where you see that something's not quite, something's wrong here. 9, I mean, you look at the traditional, and it's a great example. I mean, we're talking about a name. We're not talking about some question of meaning, theological meaning. Just a basic name.
Right.
Not even an
There
important
are
character.
9 different ways in the tradition to try and answer it. Why? Why can't somebody just give you a simple answer?
Right.
What was Moses' father-in-law's name? Full stop.
And the rabbinic answer to something like that would be, it says Darshani. Tell me, I wanna understand why it's different. You don't think so?
No, there isn't that awareness. It doesn't seem. No one seems to have the awareness. Hold on a second. We're all giving you these answers. You do disagree with. I mean, all the different answers. I'll send you a chart and you can share with people here. After there's a great chart somebody put together, and even when they put it together, I don't think they're quite aware that the problem they're facing. But there is, what do you mean meaning? There's not Darshani. There is very little in terms of that. What kind of meaning do you derive from the changing of somebody's name 9 different, or in so many different ways? So I don't think there isn't an awareness of the depth of that problem.
Right.
Could have been a second wife.
Who's
From
also
a second wife.
Another man.
Why?
different father-in-law.
Yeah, the second wife.
Why do you say second wife?
Well, maybe he had more than one wife. Maybe he had more than one
So
wife.
he has a different name for different women?
Well, no, he had
father-in-law.
Oh, it's a different father-in-law? Oh, Moshe had a different wife.
Yeah, Moshe
Oh.
Maybe he had 2 wives.
Not that I'm, well, not yet at least.
There's another
Not
text in Numbers. And
I was gonna say, right.
And both
Right.
his father-in-laws are priests in Midian.
That's right. So there's a text in Bamidbar that talks about him having Isha Kushit, right? Having this Kushite wife.
Right.
And it's not clear, and the rabbis are quick to dismiss it and say, no, it's Zipporah. But then there's other people who say that maybe it was somebody different. But yes.
Maybe Reuel had 2 names, like we have 2 names.
Well, we know that actually Yitro has multiple names
He had a bar
in the
mitzvah.
Torah. Huh?
He took a new name, he had a bar mitzvah.
He had a bar mitzvah. Jethro is a very interesting character. When we get to the story about the Aseret HaDibrot, the Decalogue, we'll look at the way that Yitro responds to the exodus from Egypt.
I think there's another answer, which is we have a concept of a name as a proper noun without a meaning of it. So like Native Americans have like running dog or something like that, and that's the nature of these names. So I think the redactor kept the names, if there was a redactor, because they all say something different.
Right.
So Yitro might mean most exalted, and Reuel means
Friend of God.
friend of El.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just
Nobody
look at-
else has 2 names, right?
Yes, that's not true.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no. They
Yaakov
have names
has
that
2 names.
change when they become.
Usually the names change
People of Israel.
sometime connected to a breed,
Yeah.
right? The names will change.
Right.
So, okay. Bob, will you read chapter 3? We're going to start in verse 1, and I'd like to read through verse 15. Okay? Yeah, I know, sorry.
Now Moses, tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, drove the flock into the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. An angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed, and there was a bush all aflame, but the bush was not consumed. Moses said, "I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up?" When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." He answered, "Hineni." And he said, "Do not come closer. Remove your sandals from your feet. The place on which you stand is holy ground." "I am," he said, "the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord continued, "I have marked well the plight of my people in Egypt, and have heeded their outcry because of their taskmasters. Yes, I am mindful of their sufferings. I have come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them out of the land, a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the region of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. Moreover, I have seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. Come therefore, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you shall free my people, the Israelites, from Egypt. Then Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and free the Israelites from Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and shall be your sign that it was I who sent you. And when you have freed the people from Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. Moses said to God, When I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, Eyeh asher eyeh. He continued, Thus shall you say to the Israelites, Eyeh sent me to you. And God said further to Moses, Thus shall you speak to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This shall be my name forever. This my appellation for all eternity.
Okay, great. So, God and Moses meet for the first time. And in doing so, there's a lot of stuff that happens. So I want to go first to verse 1, and I want to notice where they meet each other. Where does Moses meet God? What's the name of the place? Horeb. What is Horeb? All right, there's a debate about what it is. Is it a specific place? Is it exactly the same place as Mount Sinai? Or is it some other place? And by the way, you'll see in different versions, depending on if it's E or if it's J, sometimes they'll use Mount Sinai, Har Sinai, and sometimes they will use Har Horeb. Right? And each author kind of takes an assigned reading. Who is the writer of verse 1?
No, this is the...
It's E,
Elohim.
and typically, or the Elohim, and typically with J, you will see Sinai. You'll see Sinai. All right, so that's the first thing. And one of the things, look in verse 2, you will notice some different language from verse 1. Verse 1 says he gets to Har HaElohim, and verse 2 says, Vayera Malach, an angel of Yudhe Vaveh, right? Of Yahweh. It's almost like it's interspersed one back and forth to the other. And what does he see? What does Moses actually witness?
Burning bush.
He witnesses a bush, and he also witnesses an angel. And he gazes, and what does he notice about the bush? It's not consumed, but it's on fire. Moses says, I must turn aside to look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? And when he gets close, who calls him? Adonai. Calls him, and he turns away. But if you look at verse 4, you actually have a couple of different things in there. Vayar Adonai kisar lirot, vayikra elav Elohim mitoch hasneh, vayomer Moshe, Moshe, vayomer hine. So in verse 4, when he's meeting God for the first time, there are two different names of God. You got Hashem, and you've got Elohim. All in one verse. Don't ask me who wrote it, because I don't really know. Okay? And by the way, Friedman, if you haven't read the notes, it's worth reading the note in Freedom on the bottom of page 122, because he goes through in detail about why this text is so confusing. Because we have multiple names of God, all in one story. And in particular, this is when Moses is meeting God for the first time. You would think that if God was going to meet Moses for the first time, God would have prepared his speech a little bit more clearly so that, they could have a more straightforward conversation. What does Moses do, though, in reaction to finding out that it is God who's talking to him? What does he do? He wants to know who you are, and he does some physical things, right? He said, don't come closer, take off your sandals because you're standing on holy ground. And then God makes an introduction. How does God choose to introduce God's self to Moshe? I'm on verse 6. Good, so there's a reminder here of the lineage. Why is that helpful?
That's credibility.
Adds credibility. Why else?
Tell me which God he is.
Good, tells him which God he is. What else?
Does Moses know his lineage at this point?
That's the question.
That's an interesting question. Good question. Does Moshe know his lineage? Hold that thought for 1 second, and I want you to turn back to the beginning of chapter 2. Look at chapter 2, verse 1. How does our story introduce Moses is coming onto the scene. What's Moses' yichus? He comes from the house of Levi. Who is Levi the son of? Jacob. All right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Presumably, this is making an argument that Moshe knows where he's coming from in some way, shape, or form, even though he grows up in an Egyptian household, even though he comes to the rescue of the Hebrews, even though the Midianite women refer to him as Egyptian. Presumably, God thinks that this is a good way to connect with Moshe.
I don't understand something. It says he gazes on the bush.
Yep.
And then he says, I need to look aside to see it better.
Yeah.
What does that mean? I mean,
All right.
if you're looking at something, why would you then,
Or you go closer to it.
I mean,
He was just
You know,
struck,
like,
maybe.
if I see something interesting, I might walk a block to get a closer view of it.
but it doesn't say he came closer, it said he
Said he
turned
turned
aside.
Right. So what is the turning aside?
We're turning aside from going following this flock or
Yeah.
something. Maybe
Presumably, he's straying off the path from where he was supposed to in order to be able to pay attention to this.
I see. He turned aside from this direction.
Right.
from where he was going.
Not turned aside.
There's actually a great midrash that suggests that what Moses was doing is he was tending to his flock,
Flock.
and he noticed that one of the sheep in the flock went astray.
Right.
And so to show just how kind and compassionate and who Moshe was as a leader, Moshe went after the lone sheep in order to bring him back, and it was in that moment that God appears to him in the bush.
But that's commentary.
That's common. That's a midrash. It's not in the text. Well, it depends on if you care about it or not. You care about it because one of the reasons that, when we think about this is why Moses? Why is Moses the person? Right? It could be as what Gary said before, which is that we now have all of this interesting context about who he was. He stands up for what's right. He, hits the Egyptian who's striking the Hebrew. He helps the women at the well, and here he is, he cares about my sheep. Right? Or whatever it is. So it gives us some context, and that's part of what Midrashim accomplished.
It also
Okay.
seems to add a certain level of plausibility,
Okay?
because the bush doesn't appear in an area, let's say, in the Midianite camp,
Right.
where everyone could see it.
Right. By the way, what is it that get Moses' attention according to the story?
It didn't burn.
It was not
Look at verse 2. The angel.
the angel, right?
Vayera malach Adonai elav. An angel of the Lord appears to Moses, right, in a blazing fire out of a bush, and Moses gazes and he sees what's actually there. Yeah.
It's interesting that it's a bush.
Good. Yes. Great.
That it's something common.
Yeah.
That everyone sees everywhere. I mean, I think it's really important that it's not something bigger. It's not flashing. It's a bush.
Yeah.
It's just a bush.
So let's imagine for a moment that we were all rabbis sitting in the Beit Midrash studying this text, and we wanted to ask the question, why a bush? What are some of the possible answers that we might give?
It has to be flammable for one thing.
Okay, it has to be flammable. Good. There's a lot of bush in the den. By the way, it's probably better that it was a burning bush and not burning dolphin skins. Okay, right?
So yeah, there are. I mean, you have rocks and you have bush.
Okay, so it's something that was there, practically speaking. It was something there. What else?
The fact that it was not consumed was in itself miraculous.
Good. So there's something miraculous about the fact that it's burning but not consumed. What else?
It's plain and simple, it's not
Great.
elegant.
Good. And so you just became an author of a midrash, right? The midrash says that God can appear even in the most simple, plain, and unsuspecting
And in
things.
fact, that's the most amazing. That
Yep.
I think is what's more interesting about
Right.
it is that it's so simple as opposed to something real flashy.
Right.
I think that's what makes it really.
By the way, the midrashim go even a step further, and they tell you what kind of bush it was. Bush with thorns, and bush with berries, and like that a bush that is surrounded by thorns can still give off fruit, right? Which is a metaphor for Israel. Right? Israel will always be surrounded by people who are sharp and prickly and whatever, but even amidst that, it can bear fruit.
Why does God have to send an angel, an intermediary?
Ah, great question. Good question. So, I want to show you one other thing.
What did Barbara say?
Barbara asked the question, why does God, specifically Yudhe Vavhe, appear to Moshe as through an angel and not himself?
Right.
So let's go back and look at one other story. All right? Go back to the story of the Akedah, of the binding of Isaac. Chapter 22 of Bereshit. I'm looking specifically on page 120. Now, if you remember from when we looked at the binding of Isaac, who was the God, what name of God was used to describe this moment of Abraham, take your son and take him to slaughter? It was Elohim. It was, okay? But, all of a sudden, look at verse 10. I'm on page 120. Verse 10. Vayishlach Abraham et yado. He takes his hand and he's about to raise it up to slaughter. Vayikach et hama'achel lishchot beno. He takes the knife. He's about to consume or slaughter his son. Vayikra elav malach Adonai. The angel of the Lord calls out to him in Hashamayim. Vayomer Avraham, Avraham. Vayomer Hineni. It is almost identical language to the way that Moshe encounters God.
He has to be called twice.
Say again?
He has to be called twice.
Well, there's a lot of interesting commentary about that. Why do you think Moshe needs to be called twice? Why do you think Abraham needs to be called twice? Right? It's Vayomer Abraham, Abraham, Vayomer Hineni. In our story in chapter 3 it says, Vayomer Moshe, Moshe, Vayomer Hineni. Why does the text need to emphasize twice?
Because I think
There's
there's going to be likely to be a certain sense of disbelief on the part of the individual.
Great.
Was that the wind? What was this? Then it comes again. It may mean.
That's right. Right? It's jarring in that way. It kind of pulls you out of whatever you're doing. And in particular with Avraham, he's literally about to go through with this act.
But the Friedman says there are two different authors.
They,
For those two, for Angel of the Lord and Angel of the Lord.
You're talking, you're comparing the book? What does he say?
He says in the Reshit,
Yep.
it's the redactor.
Uh-huh.
And in Exodus, it's J.
Okay?
There are debates.
So remember what we were talking about last time, when we were looking at the binding of Isaac, what was the goal of the redactor in putting in this extra part of the text?
Tied together.
Well, not only to tie it together, but you were the one who brought it up. You said that if we don't have this part of the text, it would be more plausible that what happened? That Isaac dies on the mountain. Which, by the way, there are interpretations that suggest that too. So the redactor is inserting similar language, Barbara, as you have elsewhere in J sources to try to make a particular point. The redactor is very smart. By the way, just to be fair, we could make the argument that the redactor was God. In which case, it's no surprise that God is God. Okay? All right, it's at least worth acknowledging.
Also, every single word of this is intensely debated as to who wrote it.
Totally.
So what we have in Friedman's book is Friedman's opinion.
It is Friedman's opinion. And by the way, if you look at Friedman's interpretation, he literally goes back and forth between J and E. He's not sure half the time. And you literally have a sentence where you will have one name of God and the other name of God, and it's not talking about Hashem Elohim, it's talking about Yahweh in one case and E in another case. By the way, no wonder Moshe is confused. Right? As we keep looking at the story, what you will end up seeing is this back and forth. We're going to stop here, and we're going to come back to this, and next time I'm going to give you this article to read. And it's going to introduce where we're going to get to next time, which is chapter 6. The opening verses of chapter 6. There's no class next week, there's class in 2 weeks. But when we get to chapter 6, it's almost as if God reintroduces God's self to Moses again. All right? And we're going to get it.